several universities, including University of Arizona and University of Michigan. But her expertise is on Afghanistan's political, social, cultural history, particularly 19th century and 20th century. I think she wrote her PhD thesis on King Amanullah and the Ulama's revolt against him, which was published in 1999, but then translated in Farsi and published in the Farsi version was published in 2010 in Kabul. So this is one of her papers or her articles in a book which is edited by another historian of Afghanistan and Iran, Nile Green. And in a way, Nile Green also outlines a sort of historiography of Afghanistan from pre-modern time to modern time. The pre-modern time, he classifies it in a way that it was either genealogical, right, or dynastic history, and the modern one is the nationalist history. So Senzil Nawid and Nile Green somehow talks parallel to each other.
Moving on, so what we will discuss today is how a couple of items which I have listed over here. What was the transformation from a court chronicles to modern historiography? That's two different genres of history. We will talk about the impact of Afghanistan Historical Association or Anjuman al-Tarikh Afghanistan and how they crafted history, and the four key historians that Senzil Nawid highlights as a main historians of Afghanistan in 20th century. And finally, she also talked about the impact of Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, the Khalq and Parcham regime on historiography of the country. So what is the key point that Senzil Nawid argues in this chapter? One of the key theses, one of the main points, and she argues is that Afghanistan's modern historiography is product of a collaboration between ruling elite, particularly here Khanadan Nader, and the liberal intelligentsia or historians of Afghanistan. So we will talk about why they are called liberal and how they are different from the previous generations of historians. So the characteristics of this period was, of course, a state sponsorship of history. History was not written by independent individuals. It was all sponsored and controlled by the state, meaning that whoever wanted to write an independent history critically, they were not allowed. The ones who were appointed by government, they were censoring, they were rewriting, they were somehow banning books, as you see in this chapter. But also, apart from state sponsorship, one or two individuals had an agency or capacity to write history of Afghanistan independent of the state. And those were the liberal intelligentsia that she characterized them. She considers four figures as a founding historians of Afghanistan: Kohzad, Habibi, Ghobar, and Popalzai. These were the ones who shaped history to a large extent. And most of this historiography happened throughout the almost, you can say, the first half of 20th century, beginning in 1930s, ending in 1980s. And though she discusses in 1980s what happens when Parcham regime or Democratic Republic of Afghanistan comes to power. So these are the four historians. To give you just brief overview, Ahmad Ali Kohzad, he was born in 1907, and he was mainly an expert of ancient history of Afghanistan, which is they call it Aryana. Abdullahi Habibi, he was born 2 years later after Kohzad, a bit younger compared to Kohzad. He was an expert of Khorasan history or Islamic era history of Afghanistan. And then we have Ghobar, who is the eldest one amongst all these four figures. He was born in 1897. And he also passed away a bit early compared to others in 78. And he provided a grand narrative of over 2,000-year history of Afghanistan. But he is also somehow, one can say, he wrote both on Khorasan and he wrote on Aryana as well. So he wrote on both of them. And then finally, the last figure, Abdulaziz Wakili Popalzai, he was born in 1919, much younger compared to the other three scholars or historians. He particularly he didn't focus on Aryana history or Khorasan history, unlike Kohzad and Habibi and Ghobar. His was very much recent and Durrani imperial history and the later kings. He wrote on Ahmad Shah Abdali, his son Temur Shah, and his grandson Shah Shuja. And then later on, he also wrote a couple of books on Amanullah Khan. So one of the key questions that author Senzil Nawid pose is, while history of 20th century Afghanistan was all unstable, the only window of stability was the 40 years rule by Zahir Shah, and that era provided a framework or a ground for writing history of Afghanistan, which was a particular kind of history, a nationalist history, not any other kind of history. And the state sponsored it. How did the state sponsor it? The state sponsored it through funding certain institutions, financing archaeology, because history is always based on evidence, and evidence comes either from archives or archaeology. So these were quite prominent in this era. But finally, he asked the question, to what extent state actually controlled historiography, right? So do you think, now I want to ask a question, if a state controls history, do you think that history will be neutral and reliable or not? A state is a political institution, and a state does not represent a neutral stance, particularly if it is not democratic. And we know that a state under Zahir Shah and his father Nadir Shah was not democratic at all. It was a dynastic rule, it was authoritarian, people were suppressed, the historians themselves were suppressed. So a state crafts and tells to what extent what side of history should be written and how it should be written, right? Remember, I presented this image in our introductory session. I don't know how many of you do remember it, but this layouts the evolution of historiography in Europe, and particularly in Western countries. So it starts with a dynastic history, a genre of history which only focuses on who rules, then goes on to the nationalist history, then comes a democratic history, when democracy evolves. And then comes, of course, later on a critical history wherein people deconstruct what was written earlier or criticize what was written earlier. And most recently, pluralist history, which means it considers diverse opinions. So in this chapter, Senzil Nawid, and in the audio talk by Nile Green that I assigned you, they want to create a kind of a typology of this historiography in Afghanistan, because they talk about three different genres of history in Afghanistan. They talk about genealogical history. Genealogical history only talks about, okay, what is the roots of a particular ethnic groups, right? From where does Pashtuns came from? From where does Turks came from? From where does Tajiks came from? And then the other genre is dynastic history. Dynastic means they only focus on history of one particular royal family who rules. So in Europe, the dynastic history goes back to 16th and 17th century, but in Afghanistan, it comes even until 19th century. Genealogical history and dynastic history, both of them are prominent as later as 19th century. When it comes to nationalist history, that in Europe, it starts with the 18th century, because nationalism first starts in Europe, and Afghanistan is much, much late. Look at it, almost 2 centuries after Europe. Historiography of Afghanistan becomes nationalist, what in this chapter Senzil Nawid talk about. And probably we have to think maybe beyond Senzil Nawid and see, did we have a critical history of Afghanistan also, which is not nationalist, which is not dynastic, which is not genealogical? Or how about the pluralist approach of history? So far, did we have any pluralist historian or not? This is a question for you guys that, for example, think about recent historians of Afghanistan, the ones who are alive now. Do we have any professional historians? And if they are, what genres of history they follow from amongst this list? So now focusing on what Senzil Nawid talks, she argues that earlier history of Afghanistan was almost court chronicles, the ones who were Katabai Darbar, the ones who were hired by the court, and they were mandated to write history of the Darbar. But that changes after Nadir Shah. Before Nadir Shah, and before, actually one can say before Amanullah, to some extent, history was written from analytic court perspective. But later on, Jaman Tarikh was established, and Jaman Tarikh Afghanistan National History Historical Association, which completely drafted a different model of history for Afghanistan. So some more examples of what we call genealogical or dynastic history that both Senzil Nawid and Nile Green mentions is Tarikh Ahmad Shahi. This is written by, this is in Farsi, and it is written by court historian of Ahmad Shah Abdali, Mahdi al-Husseini, wherein in this book, he exclusively talks about how Ahmad Shah Abdali came to power. He considers Ahmad Shah Abdali as king of Khorasan, but the founder of Afghani dynasty. So remember these two differences, because this is a dynastic history. It's about one lineage, one family who rules, and that is Abdali or the Afghans. But he was not ruling over Afghanistan only. Afghanistan was just one region. He was ruling over what the historian himself, the court historian of Ahmad Shah Abdali, calls him, King of Khurasan, Shah Khurasan, Ahmad Shah Abdali. Anyway, so the second example she gives is Nawai Maurik, Sounds of Battles by Ata Muhammad Shikarpuri. That was written also in 1850s and later on published in Kabul. This was also somehow dynastic history. Tarikh Sultani, similarly, Sultan Muhammad Durrani has written it in 1880s. Gulshan Emarat, Rose Garden of Emarat, Nur Muhammad Nouri, again a classic version of 19th century historiography. And finally, Padshahane Mutaakhir Afghanistan, Mirza Yaqub Ali Khafi. So these are the examples that Senzil Nawid gives in terms of how his pre-modern history or pre-national history of Afghanistan was crafted by some historians. In a separate slide, I wanted to talk about what Nile Green also, in his talk what was assigned to you guys, and he also talks about how we moved from a genealogical history to dynastic history, and from dynastic history to nationalist history. So he provides different examples. Tarikh Khan Jahani, this is a genealogical history which talks about, it was published in India by a Persian author, Nematullah Hirawi. Probably he comes from Herat. And it was written in Deccan, South India, long back in 1615. But it talks about who are Pashtuns. It's a genealogy of Pashtun tribes. And then comes Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani's book, which is in Arabic, but also Tatamat al-Bayan fi Tarikh Afghan, and that is also a genealogical history written in late 19th century. Taj al-Tawarikh is written by Amir Abdurrahman Khan. Abdurrahman Khan, the king, didn't write it himself. He hired an individual, an historian on behalf of him, which Abdurrahman Khan was dictating, and he was writing Taj al-Tawarikh was written, but Taj al-Tawarikh was not a genealogical history, it was a dynastic history. And finally, we have Saraj al-Tawarikh. Saraj was the title of Amir Habibullah, son of Amir Abdurrahman Khan, which was written by Faiz Muhammad al-Khatib. And that was published or finished somehow in 1912, but republished in Afghanistan much, much later in 2010. Now, all of these historians are pre-modern history, which means pre-national. They do not write a national history of Afghanistan. Because if back then in 19th century, the nation of Afghanistan didn't exist. Nation is a modern phenomena, right? Like Europe, and when European nations emerged in 17th and 18th century, the nation is a form of consciousness that people think that they belong to a common, they have a common vision of the future, but they also have a vision of the past or a memory of the past, which a common memory of the past, but also they claim a political right for self-determination, which means they should be ruled by themselves, by a kind of democratic rule, probably in modern times that we can talk. And so nation as a modern phenomena, it didn't exist in 19th century. Now, particularly Faiz Muhammad Khatib, the last historian that which was mentioned by Nile Green, is important, and Senzil Nawid also highlights his contribution to history of Afghanistan. His volume, which is 4-volume history of Afghanistan, is called Torch of History, Saraj al-Tawarikh, and it starts from Ahmad Shah Durrani and ends with Habibullah Khan. Do you see this as a genealogical history? Apologies, a dynastic history. It talks about 2 dynasties. The first one is the Durrani dynasty, and then he moves on to a second dynasty, which is Muhammad Zaid dynasties, starting from Amir Dost Muhammad Khan onwards, till Habibullah Khan. Some people consider Khatib as a modern historiography of Afghanistan. Modern in the sense that his historiography was not ornamentation. He didn't praise anyone, and he didn't talk much judgmental about any kind of political rule. So he tried to be as plain as possible in his historiography. That's what makes him modern in a sense. But he was also not modern, because with modern historiography, we mean a national historiography, as we talked about the patterns of historiography over here. So the modern historiography starts with nationalism in 18th century, not with the dynastic history of any country. And now, okay, so his 4th volume was published much, much later. The 3 other volumes were published earlier, but 4th volume was published in 2010, republished probably, one can say. But apart from that, Saraj al-Tawarikh, he has written a couple of other volumes also on history. For example, Tarikh Inqilab, which is about the fall of Amanullah Khan and how Habibullah Khan Kalakani ran an inqilab or revolution or a revolt against Amanullah. And then he has, this is a kind of Najatname Afghan is a kind of genealogical book which only talks about genealogy of Pashtun tribes. Remember, by late 19th century, early 20th century, Afghan was still referred only to Pashtuns in Afghanistan, not the rest. So when he also wrote Najatname Afghan, he doesn't talk about other ethnic groups like Tajiks and Hazaras and Turks, but only Afghans. Despite the fact Faiz Muhammad Khatib himself was an Hazara by ethnicity. Now, and rise of nationalism marks the beginning of modern historiography in Afghanistan. And probably, so you may ask when nationalism emerged in the country. So Senzil Nawid traces the roots of nationalism to Amanullah era, the time that the country itself got its independence in 1919 from British. And he established a certain forms of reforms. One of those reforms included establishment of a newspaper, which Saraj al-Tawarikh was established by his father, actually, by Abibullah's father. That's why it is called Saraj, because Saraj was the title of Amir Abibullah. But later on, Abibullah banned the newspaper after a short while because he didn't tolerate criticism. And when Amanullah comes back to power, he allows his father-in-law, Mahmud Tarzi, to re-establish the newspaper. So Tarzi, he educated. He lived his early years of life after his family was sent into exile by Amir Abdurrahman Khan. They lived in Damascus, an Ottoman Empire, wherein he got exposed to an diverse intellectual environment. He learned from great scholars like Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani, who himself was in the region. He was traveling across the region, particularly the Ottoman Empire, and he was living for some time in Istanbul. So he got influence from nationalist ideas of the Turks, and he envisioned the same forms of nationalism that Turks had in Ottoman Empire for Afghanistan. So he started a series of articles in the newspaper called Din Dawlat Watan. So try to craft or conceptualize for the first time the idea of Watan. So these terms were quite new back then in 1920s. The idea of Watan earlier had a localized meaning. Even now that in our local language, when we talk about Watan, sometimes people refer to their own province or to their own neighborhood as Watan, not the modern concept of homeland as a state. So he tries to conceptualize the relationship between what is the relationship between Islam, the modern state, homeland, and the new forms of identity, which was nation. But modern historiography of Afghanistan, according to Senzil Nawid, to a large extent, was written by non-spatialists. What does she mean by non-spatialist? Non-spatialist means none of the historians of Afghanistan was trained as a historian in universities. They didn't receive academic training. So they were like somehow like in music, we have a genre in Afghanistan, musiqi, for example, Ahmad Zahir onwards. None of these guys were also trained as a trained musician, right? By profession, they were coming from a different background, probably. And so that matters because history as a discipline itself is a young discipline, and and I will talk a bit in a while when the Department of Historiography or History was established at Kabul University. Now, the main shift comes after, during Amanullah, of course, some archaeological agreements are signed with French, and some French scholars comes and explores Afghanistan's archaeological sites. But in terms of writing history, it is under Nadir Shah, because Nadir Shah established, he was, before becoming Shah, after Amanullah, he was an ambassador in Europe, and he got inspired by the French Académie de Française, and which was mandated to promote French culture and French language. And so when he came back, he wanted to establish the same kind of institution to promote Pashto language and Pashto culture in Afghanistan. So the society that he created had 4 key mandates, according to Senzil Nawid. It should write country's historical heritage. It should promote literature and folklore. Particularly, it should promote Pashto language. And then finally, it should talk about Afghanistan's culture and civilization. And the society itself established Mujalleh Kabul, or Kabul Journal, which was, and the second publication was Salname Kabul, or it was a yearbook, both of them dedicated to both history and literary works. The articles on history writing appeared in scattered issues of Kabul Journal. So they are not organized, completely dedicated fully to history. Articles are covering multiple issues, but some historical articles also appeared. For example, Ghubar was one of the one of the first scholars who wrote about Afghanistan's more ancient history in 1931 in the same Kabul journal, Mujalla Kabul. So this image, which is quite blurred, it shows the founders of the same society, and below over here, which it's not much visible in this screenshot, it is clearly written in French, which verifies the impact of French model of historiography and the way Afghanistan's historical society was copied, kind of based on the French model. And this society was comprised of not just historians, but they were poets, journalists, and civil servants. So it was a mix. That's why Senzil Nawid says that Afghanistan history was not written by a specialist, and the ones who were trained in history. So they come from different backgrounds. What was the logic behind this? The historiography, Afghanistan's Anjuman Tarikh Afghanistan. So it had two mandates. Of course, it wanted to write modern history of Afghanistan, but there was a reason behind it. So Nader Shah was not coming from a royal family. Amanullah's government fall apart, and Nader Shah, he didn't belong to the same lineage of Amanullah or Habibullah or Amir Abdurrahman Khan. So for some people within that lineage of Amanullah, he was considered as usurper of power, because the power should have been probably after Habibullah Kalakani. Some of this family of Abdurrahman Khan and Amanullah Khan thing, it should have returned to Habibullah, but he didn't return the power to Amanullah, as well as because he fought against Habibullah Kalakani. So most of the Tajiks, and back then, particularly in Shamali, considered Nader Shah as Nader Ghadar, later on as he was characterized under the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. So in order to boost, so he had a crisis of legitimacy, how to prove that he is the king and he has a right to be the king. In order to do that, he has to gain legitimacy, right? And so one way to gain legitimacy was to narrate history, to mandate people and journalists and historians to write in favor of him. So one key example was a book which was written by Anis. We have a newspaper called Anis, which is named after it's called the journalist who founded the newspaper, Mahyuddin Anis, in 1927, during King Amanullah's era. So he wrote a book in favor of Nader Shah, or one can say that he was forced to write it. Crisis and Deliverance, Najat Afghanistan, Buhran wa Najat Afghanistan. So, and this Nader Shah was considered as the one who is Naji of Afghanistan. And remember, and how many of you, I don't know if you know that in Mandawi of Kabul, a minaret was built called Minar Najat, and to support the cause of Nader Shah somehow. So Mahyuddin Anis wrote this book, but later on he was imprisoned by the same dynasty, by Nader Shah's dynasty. And unfortunately, he passed away in prison. So remember how brutal the regime was. It was not a democratic regime. Even they did not mercy on the historians who wrote in favor of them. Mahyuddin wrote in favor of Nader Shah, but he was finally eventually imprisoned. The Afghanistan Historical Society was mandated by government. So it was not an independent institution. It was placed within the government's press department, or another way one can say Wazarat Itlaat Farhang, Ministry of Culture, later on developed as Ministry of Culture, Riyasat al-Matbu'at. So the society focused on ancient and medieval history, but as well as modern history of Afghanistan later on. It primarily published both in Farsi and Pashto. Much more later, archive was established. As you know, archive is also a key fundamental pillar of historiography, and that was established much later under President Dawood in 1978. But another institution which was very key for historiography was Kabul Museum, founded and during Amanullah Khan. But one of the key historians of Afghanistan later on, Kozat, was the head of museum as well. So there was a close kind of organic connection between Kabul Museum and Afghanistan Historical Association. So this timeline clearly shows the key institutions which was fundamental or key in terms of shaping history of Afghanistan. Kabul Museum was the first in 1922 because under Amanullah, a contract was signed with French scholars of archaeology And later on, Kabul Literary Society was founded in 1931. Afghanistan Historical Society was founded in 1942. So before Historical Society, so some historical papers or articles was published here in Kabul Literary Society, despite the fact the name doesn't carry history, but it was mandated to write history. Kabul University History Department was it came much later, almost after Second World War. And Afghanistan Journal in English. Remember, Kabul Literary Society had only 2 journals, which was in Farsi and Pashto, but Literary Journal in English was established later on in 51 and 57, and finally National Archive, which is the last one, in 74. So I spoke about this. So one of the key contributions that modern historiography of Afghanistan did was defining the ancient history, and they coined the term Aryana somehow. Despite the fact Aryana they didn't actually coin it, so they revived the term Aryana because Aryana was an European term. It was used by much of the European scholarship earlier, but what these scholars did, Afghanistan, Anjuman Tarikh Afghanistan, they refer to some ancient Eastern and Western sources. Sanskrit, for example, which is a subcontinent source, Pahlavi Avesta. I spoke about some of these briefly in your introductory session, and Gathas of Zoroaster, Zardashti, a classic Persian Shahnameh Ferdowsi, and some Greek historians, for example, Strasbourg, to talk about what is Aryana. For example, they particularly focus on the term Aryana Vijam, which includes the region, the map as it shows here, the entire region consisting modern Afghanistan, modern Central Asia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and modern Iran. All 3 of them. It consisted the name of neighborhoods or the regions mentioned and Pahlavi's Avesta, based on this source they speak. Avesta Zoroasters, they come up with 16 regions, this book, and so the modern historiography revived these names and traces to what extent modern Afghanistan is located in this, amongst the names tracing back to our Western history. So, for example, Ghubar particularly relies on Russian Orientalist scholar Bartold to say that Aryana is an area bound by Hindu Kush, Caspian Sea, Indian Ocean, and Indian subcontinent. So look how broadly Aryana is defined. So in this definition of Aryana consists of contemporary Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and Central Asia, large part of Central Asia, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan to a large extent. Abdullahi Habibi also spoke about the term Arya, but he tried to deconstruct the meaning of Arya. What does it mean? So for him, Arya came from the name, because in Farsi and classic Farsi, Arya means Najib, a person who is gentle and noble, right? But he said that it doesn't, for Habibi, Arya didn't refer to any particular race as we know it now. Arya Yiha, for instance, it referred to, it meant farmers. And since archaeology was an honorable profession, that's why the term Arya means noble individual, right? So Habibi did a lot of work, despite the fact that Senzil Nawid considers the other scholars as a scholar of, particularly Kohzad as a scholar of Aryana, but Habibi also contributed. So he, for example, said Aryana Vijam, founded in Rig Veda and Gathas, meant land of Aryans, with Vija is still used in Pashto, for example. So some of these interpretation that he does, modern historiography does not accept it, because some of for instance, the point that he connects Aryana Vijam with a modern meaning does not, I mean, in terms of linguistically, it is contested at the end of the day. That does not mean that, despite the fact Habibi refuted the racist connotation of Aryana, but that does not mean that back then the papers or articles published either in the Literary Association or later on an Historical Society did not have a racist tone, or probably, if not racist, but somehow a race connotation. So one example that she provides a screenshot shows that how Aryans was particularly redrafted or narrated as a ethnological or a racial category. Kohzad is the one who extensively worked on ancient history of Aryana. He builds on works earlier done by Ghubar and Habibi. His book comes much later, almost after 1 decade from Ghubar. He writes in 1942 a book on Ariana. But he argued that Ariana's boundary expanded in 3rd century BC to cover almost all of the modern country, regardless of internal ethnic and linguistic differences. So for him also, Ariana was quite diverse. It didn't refer to any particular one race or one ethnicity. One controversial thing, again, that he claims is that the name Iran derived from Ariana. Remember that in the Senzil Nawid refers to the fact that how some of these historians also drew from classic Persian Shahnama as well. So Shahnama was written, and as you know, under Shah Mahmud Ghaznavi, right? So it is it's 11th century, and Shahnama does not refer to the region of contemporary Afghanistan, Central Asia, Pakistan, and Iran as Ariana. Shahnama clearly uses the term Iran. So which means that what Kohzad suggests, that Iran derived from Shahnama, that's not correct. Actually, what one can argue is that Ariana is a European or Greek terminology. The Europeans and Greek people refer to our land, but native terminology in Farsi and classic Farsi, is Iran. So the difference is about how it's pronounced. One is European, the other is local. Afterlife of the term, so because the state wanted to sponsor the ancient history or identity of Afghanistan, Ariana was sponsored by different governments under Zahir Shah. So they established a national sport team, which was referred as an Ariana national team, an encyclopedia, which was established also, that was named after Ariana, which means that the state somehow appropriated this term and the ancient history of the land. Now, there is a debate whether it was racist or not. So the author here, Senzil Nawid, presents at least 2 versions of opinion. One is Abdulhamid Mubarez. He passed away recently under the Republic of Afghanistan. And the other one is Sadiq Farhang. So Sadiq Farhang and Mubarez, both of them were closely connected with historians that we spoke so far, both Ghubar and Kohzad, as well as Habibi. Because they were all working in the same institution, Afghanistan's Historical Association. But they have different understanding about why Ariana was revived. For Farhang, it had a kind of racist connotation, and because he thinks that historiography was influenced by Nazi Germany, and Nazi Germany, the ideology of Nazism was all based on pure race of Aryans. But Mubarak said, no, that was not the case. Whoever, in this case, particularly Kohzad, Ghubar, and Habibi, who coined the term Ariana, they were not influenced by Nazi ideology. And instead, what they wanted to do, they wanted to connect back to the ancient heritage of Zoroastrianism in the region, particularly Central Asia, as well as they wanted to differentiate Afghanistan from Iran, because Iran itself, the name, was changed from Persia to Iran much recently. In 1930s, Iran, in the Western scholarship, it was called Persia. When Iran requested United Nations, sent letters to the international community, and that its name should be, afterwards, should not be considered Persia, but Iran, some historians of Afghanistan protested, particularly Ghubar protested, said Iran is a common name, not just for Persia, but also for greater region of Central Asia, including Khorasan and contemporary, the other side of Mawara Nahr, even Transoxana, contemporary Samarkand, Bukhara, Tajikistan, and northern Afghanistan. So what they wanted to do, they wanted to counter Iranian narrative as well, because Iran appropriated the identity of Arya and Iran. So they instead of using the same term, which is Iran, they appropriated the European terminology of it. But however, Senzil Nawid himself, he says it is unclear. He is not sure. So he doesn't take any particular stance between these two, whether it was racist or not. To what extent directly idea of Nazi-era national Aryanism influenced historiography of Afghanistan. But what he talks now is what I also mentioned earlier, that Ariana was not coined by 20th century historians. Europeans used it first. So it is not our term, in fact. It is a European terminology. A British scholar, Wilson's Ariana's Antiqua, he spoke about a particular region which was adjacent to northern India and eastern Iran. Another key important fact, development in historiography, is archaeology, and official archaeology in Afghanistan began in 1922, but later on, after Second World War, Apart from French scholars, many other European and American archaeologists also joined. And this archaeological mission were quite fruitful because they discovered archaeological sites which indicated the rich history of the contemporary Afghanistan, which included Buddhist heritage, Hellenistic heritage, Gandharan heritage. And these scholars referred to Greco-Bactrian, Greco-Buddhist heritage of Afghanistan. And when they wrote history of Afghanistan, also they categorized kind of historiography of the country based on what was discovered. And one of the key scholars is Kohzad. He was born in Kabul. He went to French school, Istiqlal. That's why he was able to communicate and work closely with the DAFA, the French archaeological mission who came to Kabul. And so he was not trained as a historian, but he learned practically from the archaeologists themselves. So one can say he's also the founder of archaeology in Afghanistan. He was director of Kabul Museum. He was the first president of Afghanistan Historical Society till 1961, after which Abdullahi Habibi took the lead of the Historical Society. But he was very prolific. He wrote extensively on ancient and medieval history of Afghanistan, that some of his works are listed over here. Apart from Ariana, the second era of historiography was Greater Khorasan, focused on Khorasan. And herein, again, these historians tried to focus on how to carve an independent, a separate history from the Persian history, from Sassanid era, because contemporary Khorasan was large enough, and partly it was part of it is in Afghanistan, part of it is also in Iran. At least 3 provinces in Iran is currently it's also called Ariana. Khorasan. So what they wanted to do, their mission was to craft Khorasan as an independent entity from the rest of the Persian Empire. Particularly Ghubar, to a large extent, did this effort. And from 7th century onwards, they said whatever dynasties has emerged from these regions, they were independent of the Persian, the ancient Persian historiography. They considered themselves Shah Khorasan, and that starts from Tahirian, Safarian, Samanian, and moving onwards to Ghaznavian, Khurian. So the second historian, which is quite important, is Abdullahi Habibi. He is a Kandahari scholar, but he extensively contributed to history of Khorasan. The books that he wrote are, everyone says it's a classic book, which means it's a reference book. He wrote over 100 books and roughly 500 articles. Simply Google his name, and there is one website which is established under his name, which collects all the books that he has written. So if you're interested to read Ghubar or Kohzad and Habibi, luckily most of their books are available in Kabul bazaars. Apart from Ariana and Khorasan, so this era of historiography focused on the Durrani era as well, because despite its importance, that Ahmad Shah Abdali was and remained understudied until 1980s. And probably one of Ghubar, of course, wrote on Ahmad Shah Abdali, but he didn't write a book. He wrote a paper or an article. And probably what Senzil Nawid claims is that Abdulaziz Azizuddin Wakili Popalzai, he is the first one who dedicates 2 volumes to Ahmad Shah, Waris Mujaddid Imperaturi Afghani. But he later on, he wrote on and his son and grandson as well. So that I think 1980s is the era, despite the fact that Senzil Nawid claims that after the communist government, much of the history was not written. At least several books which was published on Ahmad Shah Durrani was in this particular era in 1980s. This is a short biography of Ghubar, one of the key intellectuals. He was born in Kabul. He's coming from Formuli background. Formulis are Tajiks, but he had several careers. He was a diplomat in Europe. He served as journalist in Afghanistan. He established Tarikh Afghan, a biweekly newspaper. And later on, he became a historian also, but he also founded a political party. So he was also a politician. He entered the national parliament, the very first elections which happened in 1949, which is also considered the liberal parliament, because these guys didn't belong to any royal family or the dominant class of society. They come from the middle class or lower class of society. One of the classic works of Ghubar is Afghanistan Dar Masir Tarikh. And it was a controversial book because government earlier allowed the book to be published, but later on it banned it. And there are different controversies why it was allowed first and later on it was banned. And Senzil Nawid also discusses some of those ideas. And one idea is that the Prime Minister, Etemadi, banned it because Ghubar criticized his grandfather. Etemadi's grandfather was a prime minister earlier as well in 1920s, and he prevented sort of constitutional movement in Afghanistan. The Etemad al-Dawla, Abdul Qudus Khan, Etemad al-Dawla, the prime minister under Amanullah, he had an opposition to the establishment of constitutional government, and Ghubar took a stance on it. And later on, when Ghubar was writing this history book, Nur Mahmad Etemadi became prime minister, which comes from the same family, so he didn't like what Ghubar wrote. So that's one idea, that's why this book was banned. But overall, Ghubar was quite critical of Nader Shah as well, the brutality of Nader Shah, for example, to what extent he massacred intellectuals, not just common people, but intellectuals, those who were talented, including, for example, in the case here, Anis was mentioned by Senzil Nawid, that despite the fact that he wrote Buhran al-Nujat, he was imprisoned and he passed away in prison. But the fact that the Ghubar book was banned, it made it much more popular. And apart from that, when the left government came, particularly Hizb Democratic Khalq, Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, they endorsed the narrative of Ghubar because Ghubar's historiography, to a large extent, was socialist to some extent. He uses the same terminology from socialist historiography. For example, he talks about feudalism in Afghanistan. In fact, Afghanistan was not much feudalist. It's much tribal back then in history also. But he talks about the ones who are powerless, Mustaz'afin Afghanistan, and refers to rule of farmers and the clergy, not just royal family. So he tries to highlight the rule of not just elite, not the royal family, not just to write a dynastic history, but enrich his history with the rule of layman, common people, in terms of. So that's why his book became one of the key popular books under Hizb Democratic Khalq Afghanistan. And then the last figure is, of course, Azizuddin Wakili Popalzai. He's born in Kabul, but he passed away in India in 2008. But he is not an ancient historian of Afghanistan or medieval historian of Afghanistan. He particularly focuses from Durrani era onwards. And therein, what you can see is that Senzil Nawid provides her own judgment about this historian as well. And Senzil speaks about how Ahmad Wakili Popalzai wrote history to a certain extent. It was chauvinistic at times, which means that it had ethnocentric perspective in it. While she does not consider Habibi, Kohzad, and Ghubar the same lineage or the same kind of characteristics. Simply, he considers Ghubar an outlier, in fact, because Ghubar was also able to write history which was a bit critical of the mainstream historiography. The last point that I will stop with is discussing a bit about the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan between 78 to 92. So for more than a decade, this government was not able, unlike the Nader's and Zahir Shah's era, to establish particular genres of history or a school of historiography, despite the fact that they were strategizing to narrate history of Afghanistan based on Marxist Leninist approach. So a kind of independent, a kind of key figure like Ghubar, like Habibi, did not born in this era. So much of the history which was written was also part of the Journal of Academy of Sciences. In fact, they abolished Afghanistan Historical Society and merged it as one department of Academy of Sciences, because that was the tradition in the Soviet Union's style. A new newspaper column under this, one of the key examples that Senzil Nawid provide was this column, which was written anonymously by one historian, Tarikh Sukut Meshkanat, which later on it appeared that this column was written by Sayyid Qasim Rishtiya. Sayyid Qasim Rishtiya was also a historian of Afghanistan. He's brother of Mir Siddiq Farhang, افغانستان در 5 قرن اخیر که نوشته. So Siddiq Rishtia earlier he wrote this column تاریخ سکوت مشکنت and criticizing how the Nader Shah's rule, but later on when these articles were published in English, he published it in his own name. So that's why later on it was revealed that who wrote those papers. The final judgment that he gave, despite the general rise of publication in numbers, because there were more publications coming out of Academy of Sciences, Democratic Republic of Afghanistan's attempt at a Marxist-Leninist historiography did not succeed, meaning that they were not able to create a particular genre of historiography, which should break away from the previous one. The Marxist era in 1980s and early 90s did not produce new historians of note, probably. But Ghubara, to a large extent, is accepted by most of these this era. So I will stop here and